Hi there, I'm Cheryl Nicholas. I'm an Associate Professor of Communication Arts and Sciences at Pennsylvania State University, Berks campus in the United States. My research deals with how communication, and I mean verbal and non-verbal communication, constitutes and is constituted by cultural worldviews. I'm an ethnographer. I do a lot of my research in Malaysia. In fact, I grew up in Malaysia. I came to the United States in my mid-20s and went to school here and continued to live here. But my family is still in Malaysia and I go back as often as I can. I mentioned I'm an ethnographer. What I do is to hang out in different cultural contexts. So I hang out and I collect data while I'm hanging out. Specifically, I do field observations and also interviews. Lots of interviews and conversations when I meet people while I'm out in the field. What I try to do is learn about culture from the inside. Cerita Hantu was one of my earlier research projects and done as part of my doctoral dissertation. I conducted my ethnography in Malaysia over 2 years to complete this work. I grew up with ghost stories. I was surrounded by them. I remember growing up in Malaysia and family members would come to my house for Nescafe time where we'd talk about all kinds of things, including Cerita Hantu. Going to school, I would hear these stories from friends. I would hear these stories at the marketplace. So people told a lot of these stories in Malaysia and they remained with me. I was frightened of ghosts. I was frightened of Hantu as much as I was fascinated by them. So naturally, I gravitated towards this topic for my doctoral dissertation since I study everyday talk, since I study storytelling. I also wanted to write about something that would appeal to a variety of audiences. And Cerita Hantu is certainly one of those kinds of topics that would do that. Well, stories in general are incredibly important. You know, they provide entertainment, they help us connect with each other, they're a form of escapism, they help us relax. They are also really, really important propellers of culture. They give us information, our history, our identity, they help us learn about each other, and also they give us information about expected behavior. They in a sense, they work as socializing agents. So these stories are incredibly powerful, and Cerita Hantu is not very different. But the thing is, people don't think about Cerita Hantu in this way, right? We think about Cerita Hantu as merely as a source of entertainment or a thing we do to frighten each other, but we don't think about them as these incredible tools that can socialize us, that are meaningful in these other powerful ways. These stories have been around for a long while. In fact, oral traditions have historically been passed from generation to generation, and I think it'll keep going on that way. As long as we keep talking to each other, as long as groups keep hanging out and sharing stories, these stories will continue. In the modern era, I find more interesting that we've developed different avenues for telling stories, such as the internet. It's also notable to say that books and movies, I picked up these books in Malaysia when I was doing my research. So books, movies, magazines, these have become really interesting places to find Cerita Hantu and ghost stories. Well, I mentioned that I do ethnography. So I hung out in various places where people congregated. Eating stalls, what we call gerai makanan. I hung out in those areas. I struck conversations with people, which led into the doing of my research or conversations about my research. I hung out in parks in my hometown of Taiping. I hung out at the Taiping Lake Gardens. I also conducted interviews with friends, and those interviews snowballed to people they knew and so on and so on. And I went to different places where there was information about ghosts, from libraries to exhibitions. I also collected a lot of mediated information, movies, magazines, books, as I've showed you just now, newspaper clippings, those sorts of things. The dissertation was conducted over a period, or the research for the dissertation was conducted over a period of 2 years. I was living in the United States at the time, and so I went back to Malaysia every summer for 2 or 3 months and every winter for a month or two to collect data. So a couple of times a year over a period of 2 years, and that's how I collected my data. So my research focuses on race, class, and gender. And so I'll talk about two popular ghosts in Malaysia as they relate to race and gender. And I'll start by talking about the Orang Minyak. The Orang Minyak is a supernatural being that's both a ghost and a man. He plunders, he pillages, he abducts women and children for nefarious gains. He slathers his entire body in oil, in like a dark oil, so much so he's slippery. It's really hard to catch him. He's used very much to scare children, you know. behave, or the orang minyak will come. Next, we are talking about the Pontianak, where we have really interesting commentary on gender. Pontianak is probably the most popular ghost in Malaysia. If you ask most Malaysians, they'll be able to tell you about Pontianak if you ask them about ghosts. And there are many variations of the story. So what I'll pick is probably some of the more typical themes that come up, right? She can be beautiful, and she can also be macabre. She uses her beauty to seduce men. She drags them away once she seduces them and kills them. She has this long flowing black hair. She's sometimes seen carrying a tombstone, and she also has flowing white robes. She's said to fly backwards. So she flies backwards, and her hair and robes flapping on the tops of treetops and atap houses have a flapping sound, something like that. So if you hear that at night, you know the Pontianak is around. She has a very typical shriek, typical hantu shriek. Something like that. As you can see, she's this really very distinct, very compelling character. But here's where it gets interesting. If you trap her, if you catch her, then you can own her. And the story goes that there are popular or powerful bomos or mediums that are able to own her. And the way they do that is by piercing the back of her neck with a sharp instrument, like a sharp nail or something like that. And once you own her, she belongs to you. You control her. She becomes the perfect wife, mother, daughter, whatever you want her to be. So this is a really interesting narrative about womanhood in Malaysia. The woman who's free, the woman who's not controlled is demonic, and yet the woman who's controlled and who's owned and who does what she has to do is angelic, or it's a good thing to have this sort of thing. So this binary is incredibly interesting and really very much a reflection on the inherent patriarchy in Malaysian culture. Well, we have to perhaps think about changing the story, changing the narrative. And I don't mean substituting the narrative with something else. I mean changing how we tell the story. It's important to note that these narratives exist within specific cultural frames, that these narratives reflect and attend to already existing meaning systems. So what we need to do is perhaps tell us different ways to think about the story, right? Because all of this is already systemic. It's in the system. For instance, we can tell the story about Pontianak without perhaps celebrating her captivity. We can talk about her as this really compelling, really nuanced woman, and that's one way of thinking about Pontianak, not just as evil or good based on whether she belongs to us or doesn't belong to us, but as this really complex character. Another way to think about doing this is to perhaps offer different types of representations. Perhaps this one patriarchal representation isn't the only thing we get or the only thing we see. So importantly, many of these stories, or the stories I've researched and collected, reflect our cultural values. Don't be rude, follow the law, listen to your parents. These are good values, right? But they also reflect the problematic value around race, gender, and so on, as I've talked about. So in the end, it's not merely that we tell these stories. It's about how we tell these stories, recognizing the larger context, the larger system that supports them.